That was great, Kelly. I'm Chip Northrup. I'm from Texas, and let me just get a sense of where I am here. How many of you have leased your land for gas or oil drilling so far? Okay. How many of you have drilled a gas or oil well? Okay. How many of you have owned an oil rig or gas rig? Okay. How many of you have sued a town over its zoning and won in court? Okay. Anybody else? No? Okay. How many of you have sued for a regulatory taking against the town and won? No, you hang on to it if you don't mind. In court? Huh? No? Nobody? Okay. Just me, huh? Well, that's odd. How many of you built a solar collector? Huh? How many of you have installed a solar collector? Run a vehicle on natural gas? Anybody? I can't see. Huh? Are you holding your hands up? Converted vehicles to run on natural gas? Can hardly see. Okay, I just wanted to get a kind of a sense of, who the real gassers were here. Go ahead. The state of New York, and by the way, everything in red goes to a paper. So in other words, if you look up that title in red, it'll go to a paper that goes to other papers, some of which are peer-reviewed, some of which are just reviewed by my wife, Nancy. The state of New York has the absolute worst setbacks for gas wells in the United States. There's no state in the United States where the gas well setback from a house, a pond, a stream, whatnot, is worse than in New York State. It's got the worst, probably, fracs disposal scenario because it has basically no place to get rid of the fracking flowback that Ron went over in detail is what was in it. And as Kelly mentioned, it's got probably the worst compulsory integration law in the United States, particularly as that law is practiced, as it's implemented by the Mineral Management Agency, by the DEC. Go ahead. So the point of this is that the state, from a regulatory standpoint and from other standpoints, is in no way ready to have a horizontal hydrofracking of shale come into the state. This is a table. These are municipal setbacks on the right from various states, and it's also in some cases county setbacks. And then on the left are the setbacks in New York State of a gas well, of a shale gas well, a kind of well that Ron described. From a pond, it's a 0. From a stream, it's 150 feet. It's 100 feet from a house, meaning and all that stuff that you saw on the slide, they could drill that well 100 feet from your house. If you're forced into that well under compulsory integration, which has happened in this state, that means they could put that drill rig 100 feet from your house. Go ahead. Sounds kind of far-fetched, but those are the regs. Again, that's searchable, that DEC worst practices. The DEC was audited in '94, and they basically flunked the audit. They had the same problems then that they have now. Dr. Bishop mentioned one of them. He didn't tell you how many inspectors there are, but there's only about 15 of them for the whole state to take care of all these Texans and trucks. They went through this S-guys over 3 iterations. They said, 1,500 pages. The fact is that they have very few rules and regulations in this state. The S-guys is just what it says. It's a generic impact statement. It's not hard rules and hard regulations. And as you saw on those setbacks, what they do have in terms of regulations are pretty sorry. The DEC is compromised because New York State is one of the few states where they combine both the regulatory or the environmental agency function with the well permitting function. In most states, that's separated. In other words, the state would have an environmental agency that would be looking after the environmental problems, and then they'd have a separate agency that would issue well permits. In Albany, it's sort of a one-stop shop. You just go pay somebody off, you get your well permit, you go. That's a problem. Those functions should be bifurcated. Go ahead. This is both Ron and Kelly alluded to this. The industry is pretty good about coming in here and sort of bamboozling people. This is an old Halliburton slide. That's the Marcellus, that lower line, and then the upper line is aquifers, the depths of water. And what they say is, and I heard people say this the first time 2 years ago, they said, well, you know, the shale is way down there and my well is real shallow up here, and so I'm safe because it's, you know, 4,000 feet or something between the shale and my water well. Well, what that graph doesn't show is that there's fissures between that shale and that water, and more importantly, once you drill the well, you've got a well bore between the shale and all the bad stuff that Ron listed down there and that water. So there's going to be communication between what's down there and what's on top. The other thing is that all the bad stuff either starts out up here, the frac fluid, the fracking flow back to come back to the well. So it's all going to end up on the surface anyway, where it can go into the water. This is, you know, I guess, I don't know if they even still do this, but this was sort of the big lie about 3 years ago, was that everybody's safe because the shale was way down there. Of course, they don't run trucks down there. You know. This is, again, you know, how gas wells leak. Look at that. There's a lot of studies on this, a lot of peer-reviewed papers. But most of the good information, a lot of it comes from the industry itself. And what happens, of course, is that when you drill this well bore, and, you know, Ron went through, he sort of described how it happens. You basically have a big greasy hole, what's left. You send scrapers down there, you're trying to clean the well bore up, but basically the rock itself is pretty well greased up from the drilling mud and whatnot. You pour this, you set this casing, you pour cement to support the casing in there. The problem is that the cement on the outside of that casing does not stick to the rock. We know for sure it doesn't stick to the oily shale. It doesn't really stick very well to that greasy well bore. And so the problem that starts almost immediately is that the methane, the gas from shallow formations, doesn't have to be down the shale, starts to come up on the outside of that cement. And so basically you've created a leak, a big vent for whatever gas is down the ground, right up into groundwater. And that's in fact what is happening over in Pennsylvania and what's not. You know, people say, well, you know, we have lots of shallow wells around here, blah, 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 as Ron noted. The fact is if you produce from those shallow layers, you're creating a low pressure area, so you're actually taking the gas that's in those, say, that shallow producing zone, you're taking it up inside the pipe. If these shale wells, big holes, they're gonna go right through that stuff. So what's going to be left there is you're not going to be creating a low pressure area to pull that gas out of the shallowest formation. You're going to be creating a situation where that gas will just vent up the outside of that outermost cement. Go ahead. By the way, stop that, go back, if you don't mind. The problem, frankly, this is not a big problem in some places. In a xeric environment, in a semi-arid environment, because the problem is it's going into shallow water well. If you don't have shallow water wells, like it shows in that picture, which of course you do here in New York, it's not so much of a problem because you're venting gas up into an area where you're not pumping water out of. That's basically what happens out in West Texas. It happens everywhere. So the real problem is are you drinking out of that shallow water well? And you know, in West Texas, that's not the case. Go. As this slide shows, this isn't so bad I could have done it myself, is that and this is kind of hard for some people to believe, but out west, some of the, don't stop laughing, is that some of these wells, like the wells on our ranch, they're so deep that we're basically mining the water. In fact, that's what they call it. We're drinking water that's been down there since like the last ice age, and it tastes sort of like the last ice age, 10,000 to 20,000 years, literally. And the good news about that, other than the fact the water tastes like ice age water, is that it's not communicating with certainly any gas well or oil well drilling in the area, because it's not being recharged from the surface. So whatever surface pollution that you'd have, like the stuff that Ron detailed chemistry-wise, it's not going to get into that into that water well, because we're drinking out of a formation that's basically separated, that's isolated, that's protected. And it's to a certain extent is the case. That's sort of the design conditions under which this technology was developed. Even up in the Barnett in Central Texas, the wells are typically deep enough so that it wouldn't have this communication with the surface that causes these problems in Pennsylvania and that would, play hell in New York State. That obviously, that well in the middle of that quote dug well is the shallow wells that you have around here. Now this is a study, this is done up in Alberta, and basically on the far right, the problem is that horizontal shale wells are particularly prone or particularly able to mobilize methane, to mobilize gas out of those shallow formations. That bar on the right shows that of the two methodologies that they tested, wells up in, and this is about 2,200 wells tested positive, about 60% of them were shown to be mobilizing methane, meaning leaking. There's two testing methodologies, but the point is that the percentage of wells that do this over time literally could go over 50%. And in most of the studies, including a Schlumberger study, that is the case. These wells will in fact mobilize methane, meaning leak. They're not leaking from the inside per se. The casing, the cement around the casing is in fact the culprit. Go ahead. Now, as Kelly mentioned, New York is basically the only state, for all intents and purposes, that does where gas is tax exempt at the wellhead. Meaning, there is in other states there's a state tax. In some states, 7.5%, 7.4%, in Texas 15%, Alaska, where it's pretty stout. So the state does have no money in New York to do any kind of remediation, or to even to pay those 15 overworked staffers, at the DEC. Zero, the state has zero income from this activity directly. And they say, well, they're going to pay income tax. Well, do you really think that you're going to get Chesapeake to pay state income tax in the state of New York, with a tax loss carry forward and whatnot? It won't happen. All those Enron accountants, they didn't just disappear. They went to work for Range and Chesapeake and whatnot. They'll figure out a way how not to pay state income tax in the state. And then the other curiosity about if the state is not actually taxing the gas at the wellhead, is that nobody's out there actually looking at the well. In other words, they're not monitoring it. So that's a phenomena in this state, and as Ron pointed out, that ends up meaning that some of those wells are just get orphaned. They're not going to be looked at. They're not going to be looked at because the state has no incentive to go out there and read the meter. This is, Kelly is in fact from Middlefield, which is, and if you to get an idea of that lawsuit against that town, read the court ruling on it. It is a lesson in why zoning applies to gas wells. Land use ordinances applies to gas wells in every state of the union. It's no surprise to me that the town won. It's no surprise to me that Dryden won. And the reason why is, it's very simple. The state agencies regulate how gas wells are drilled. There's no question about that. But there's also no question that the township, because it is in fact land use, the drilling site and whatnot, that the township regulates where that well can be drilled, or in the case of Middlefield, which has no industrial zoning, and drilling is under the DEC's own definition of industrial use. It has there's no zoning, if you will, to drill a gas well in the town of Middlefield. That's the law. It's going to probably be upheld on appeal. Do you have some of these gas lobbyists running around saying that they won't? But none of them are from Texas, and none of them are for Colorado, because in Colorado and Texas, that's the law. The state regulates how, the towns regulate where. They also can regulate the setback. In other words, a town could have its own set of setbacks. If you don't like 100 feet from your house, you can make it 1,500 feet, which is what it is in Midland or Flower Mound or Grand Prairie. That's part of land use law. That's effective. That applies to gas wells, just like anything else. Go ahead. Again, frackonomics, look it up. There's a bunch of papers on it. Deborah Rogers has done some great papers, and God bless her, she picked up on that terminology. So if you look up that, you'll see papers on the economics, both the macro and the microeconomics of shale gas drilling. The problem, of course, as Kelly mentioned, is at $2 and I don't know, $2.75 or whatever it is. It's uneconomic to drill for any of these wells, just about anywhere, for dry gas, which is what we have here in New York State. And so if there's no, as she pointed out, if there's no gas well, there's no ad valorem taxes. These guys that go around and say, well, town's going to get $300,000 or $400,000 out of what well? No, it's not going to happen. They may be citing a figure from 5 or 6 years ago, you know, at $9 an MCF, but no, the answer is zero. The ad valorem tax value, the property tax value in this town on a dry hole is zero. On a wildcat well, it's a zero. The number of jobs that'll be hired locally is zero if these are wildcat wells, which is what they probably will be if there's any. Go. This is an M&A firm did this. Came out in the Oil and Gas Journal about a year ago. This was that horizontal line was the price in MCF at the time is $4.50. The vertical lines are all the different shale plays. I think the Marcellus is, I'm blinded by these lights, but I think it's probably now the third or the fourth bar from the right. What those show is the total lifting cost, including lease acquisition and whatnot, of producing the gas. And the problem is at current prices, which that horizontal line would drop by about half, is none of those dry gas fields are economic. In other words, the Marcellus would have to be, with inflation, the price of gas would have to go to $4.50 or $5 before it'd be worth even bothering to drill a well for economic purposes. Go. And then this, of course, is I think Kelly mentioned this, the SGICE did a socioeconomic study. Well, the fact is that they used some bogus numbers they got from out of some guy over in Pennsylvania. They wildly overestimated the gas reserves in the Marcellus. The USGS came out and revised those and they cut those back by about a fifth. Go. This is, well, and in terms of what they allocated when they did their economic study, which they still refer to, in terms of trying to sell the state on doing this, they estimated, and this actually, I got this from Ron, they could be, depending on the number you pick, because they did a low, medium, high, about 10 times what's actually here in terms of recoverable reserves. Go. Now, you may have heard about the southern counties and, what's the big deal there? And they said, well, they're going to do it down there because everybody wants to get fracked. Well, it's actually a little more straightforward than that. The thing is that the Marcellus is a layer cake, and the best layer is the Union Springs, which is also named after a town, I found out. Surprise, or the lack of originality amongst geologists. So that the heavy layer of that isopac, where it's yellow, orange, and then going up into the green, is thick enough, that layer, for them to basically productively produce. If you go north of that, which that's that horizontal line is the state line. So you go north of Broome County, Tioga, Chemung, whatnot. You get north of there, and the shale gets so thin, at least that formation, that it's just not productive. So when you hear about, the 5 fracking guinea pigs, it's because of that map right there. Not because everybody wants to get fracked down there. Go. This is the Utica, a little not quite as well understood, but basically, Kelly mentioned this earlier. Some speculators came in, started drilling test wells over around us and whatnot, and basically they're beginning to understand where the Utica is not, and that's key, because when you see these maps, it just looks, it's amorphous, it's all over the state. The fact is, it's never like that, and they're beginning to understand where the Utica is. Basically, that area in gray, it's cooked off. It's not productive. You get into that rose color area, that's dry Utica gas. It's deep. And then you get over towards the lakes, and they actually could be liquid. I mean, in other words, have some high ethane, propane, butane content in it, which is worth a little more money. The problem with the Utica is it gets shallower as you go east. So the more hydrocarbon content you get west of the Finger Lakes, then you're getting to some pretty shallow shale. The key is, though, and when I was looking at this map, this is the way I used to look at things, and the way the industry looks at things, is they're looking at the geological maps. They're looking at the run reports on the wells, they're not looking at the surface. I never really thought about the surface much. And I know that's not some big, sociological comment. It's just the way their mentality. If you've done this, most of them have geologic backgrounds. If you've done this for years, you're thinking in terms of what's below the surface. You're not thinking about, what's up on the top. And frankly, what's on the top is the problems. Yep. So they're really dealing with something they haven't really had to deal with before in some places. The Chesapeake's lobbyist basically wrote or rewrote the compulsory integration law in New York back in 2005. It's the wording on it is not dissimilar from some other laws. Some states, of course, famously Pennsylvania has no compulsory integration law, but some of it actually is pretty bad. The supermajority to force that your neighbor into a well is only 60%. That would be more typically, say, 70%. The problem is, though, is that the same lawyer that wrote the law, and I mean, he wrote it verbatim. He wrote it and he gave it to the DEC, and by God, they copied it. Then he turned around and ANSYS hired him, and they sued somebody, or they compelled somebody into a vertical well, I think on a 40-acre spacing. So in other words, the problem is that Texas has a compulsory integration law, but they never use it. People work things out themselves or whatnot. They very, very seldom use it. Twice, average of twice per year over the last 60 years. Some states, like I said, never use it. They don't have it. The problem in New York is not only was it written by a Chesapeake's lobbyist verbatim, is the law itself is pretty awful. But the DEC has shown that they're willing to force a homeowner, not a landowner, not some guy with a pony, but to force their house into a vertical well, and that's wrong. And I think that's going to be challenged. Go. The peculiar phenomena is the same attorneys that lost in Dryden, the zoning and land use attorneys, that lost in Dryden and Middlefield came back and they said, now what are we going to do? They knew they were going to get their butts kicked on appeal. So they went back and said, well, let's come up with this, a resolution for these towns to adopt it. So they say, come on, frack us. Frack us first. Raise your hand. And so that's in fact what they did. They drafted some jinxy little resolution, and they've gotten some town boards to basically capitulate, to say we're not going to have a road use ordinance, we're not going to have a land use ordinance. We think the DEC, those 15 overworked staffers, are going to be able to take care of us, and so y'all come on, frack us first. And some nitwits down in Broome County have actually passed that resolution, in my opinion, creating a huge liability for the town and for the pinheads that actually voted for it. Go ahead. We'll see about that. Okay, moratorium. Moratoriums are done even in Texas. The thing about a moratorium is very simple. You've got this, the whole state's been under a moratorium, so the state moratorium will be lifted, when Cuomo deems it. And when it does, then everybody will get a chance to actually look at what the regs are going to be. The smart thing to do, and you didn't have to go to Texas A&M to figure this out, is that the town passes a moratorium that goes beyond the due date of the state regs. So the town has a chance to take a look at the regs as promulgated and decide what they're going to do if they haven't made up their minds already. These are the road use ordinance, the land use ordinance. It's not like a real hard concept to figure, but that is in fact the smart thing to do, the responsible thing to do. Whether you're a gas bag or a tree hugger, that gives the town time to take a look at what these regs are going to be. So any town should, in my opinion, should adopt a moratorium. Now, again, as I mentioned, in most states, the way townships, and in some cases counties, deal with this is they apply their land use ordinances, their setbacks, their steep slope, their tree ordinances to the gas rig, the noise ordinance. There is no noise ordinance at the state level. They talk about noise, they have a whole chapter about noise. There is no decibel standard at the property line. So you don't look for the state, Texas, none of these other states, you don't look for the state to address that. The town addresses that in its zoning law, in its land use ordinance. If it thinks, well, maybe 100 feet might be a little too close, 150 feet from a school, let's rethink that. Then the town has its own land use ordinance, and by zone or by setbacks, it addresses that in its ordinance. That's the way it's done in every other state. And I'm guessing that that's the way it's going to be done here. Yep. Again, you got you have the Cuomo doing the strip tease for Chesapeake. I think maybe it's time to get your stuff together. If your town hasn't got a moratorium in place, get yourself a new supervisor or town board because it's time to get that done. Next. And this is, again, those are some of the papers that I referred to up on the top one. That thing ever gets back up, that's a blog that we do, and then that's my very private email address and my age and surname and whatnot. Thank you.